Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, Daniel Ricciardo is back in the cockpit for a 12-race blast to sort out his future. Sergio Pérez has the confidence of the board to bounce back from his form slump. And we take a look at Formula One's record-breaking 24-race calendar for 2024. My name's Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia, and it's great to have your company and the company of my co-host, just one today, from Speed Cafe. He likes his selfies and his cycling, but not in that order. It's Matt Kosh.
And I'm a massive beard enthusiast. I'm keen. Daniel's back, and Daniel and I had this running joke about my beard for a couple of years, so I'm keen to get the beard cup full this weekend. It's very exciting. Nothing to do with on track in terms of my Daniel Ricciardo excitement meter. It's all about the beard love this weekend. It really is. I can't keep a straight face. No, it should be a good fun weekend. Daniel always brings the smiles, doesn't he?
I like the idea that, people are talking, there's a lot of pressure on Daniel not to disappoint, but I like that you're very focused on personally not disappointing him. It's a good reversal of the sort of onus of expectation in sport. It's very good. I like that. For those who haven't seen, of course, the news broke last week that Daniel Ricciardo is replacing Nick de Vries, and you and I, Matt, we did a podcast the day it was announced. So if anyone wants the sort of in detail expectations and thoughts, you can go back in your podcast feed on Pit Talk or go to YouTube to hear our kind of immediate reaction to the news. But we have heard a little bit more since then. Helmut Marko made some comments in the Dutch media. Daniel Ricciardo had a sit down with F1's Lawrence Barretto as well to expand a little bit on what he's thinking ahead of his return. And Matt, I thought interesting in that chat in particular was the fact that Daniel kind of alluded to something that I guess we'd all assumed, but he's never said explicitly, but that he was a bit more purposeful in arriving at his decision to go to Red Bull specifically because, well, Red Bull has form for this kind of wild decision-making.
Well, he's a honey badger. He never stops fighting, does he? And that includes when it looks like he's on the ropes or down and out, as he seemed to look at the end of last year, and yet he had a little plan. It reminds me of Blackadder. He's got a cunning plan. And here he is, he's 6 months later, and exactly what he thought might happen in an off chance in that Red Bull's brutal axe was swung. So it's happened. Nick de Vries is out and Daniel Ricciardo's in. So it's interesting. Behind that smile is a very calculated, very intelligent individual who perhaps hams it up a little bit for the cameras at times. But it just goes to show, even though he was saying, I'm not done with F1, I'm not sure that I'll come back, but I'm not ready to call it a day, he was very clearly not done with F1. You don't make those sort of moves, on the off chance that I'll get an easy way back into Formula 1 if you don't want to come back into Formula 1. So I think he's had a 6-month game plan in the works. He's probably been having little words in Christian and Helmut's ears all the way along, I'd say.
Wouldn't surprise me. He's just rocking up to the office dressed in a racer going, oh, that looks pretty good, don't you think? Don't you think? Do you think it changes? We've talked a lot in the last 5 years, I guess, ever since he left Red Bull about decision-making around his career moves. He's changed managers in that time. He made the decision to move to McLaren, at least in a kind of hasty way, considering it was made before he even started racing in 2020 due to the COVID restrictions, and now he's ended up a reserve driver, but he's back in the cockpit. Do you think we don't or haven't given him enough credit for, I guess, the care in the decision-making he's made? I mean, one decision doesn't immediately negate potential bad ones, if that's your opinion of the last few, but I don't know, does it make you reflect differently on the way he's gone about this sort of like second half of his career decision-making wise?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one that I think pretty much everyone can relate to in one way, shape or form, because if you consider Red Bull like living with mum and dad, they brought him up through the junior ranks. They really nurtured his junior career and gave him his big break. It's like mum and dad. They looked after you. They fed you. They watered you. They sent you to school, gave you a kick up the bum when you needed it. And Helmut Marko gave him a few of those, I can tell you. But then at some point, we all want to leave the nest and go out and try and explore the world on our own. And that's where Daniel was originally. So I'm not going to discredit him for that. And in that process, I'm sure we've made some good choices and some poor choices. Definitely guilty of that one as well. So it's a very relatable story. It's a very human story. I don't think that I can fault his decision making because I think it was done with the best information and the best intentions that he had at that particular point in time. McLaren looked good back 3 years ago. Alpine, or Renault as they then were, seemed to be stagnating. Can I understand? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because you look at the blueprint there, they're hiring people, they're investing in resources, wind tunnels, simulators, all that sort of stuff. There's a team there that's building towards success versus Renault at the time, which wasn't. So do you go for a team that's on the way up or just stick with what you've got? No, I think that's a reasonable move. And ultimately at that point, what's he got to lose? Coming home to Red Bull, I think, it's a bit like most people do. At some point, you go out into the wide world and then invariably that fails and you go back home to mum and dad. Not saying that I've ever done that twice. But again, it's very relatable, isn't it? It's this very human story. It's an acceptance of where he is, and I guess also acceptance of his failures. And he's humble enough to very publicly admit that. So I think whatever has happened to his driving in the last 2, 3, 4 years, put that to one side. Daniel's maturity over the last 4 or 5 years, he's going to be a different person. Not necessarily a different driver, but a different person to what he was when he left Red Bull. And probably, again, you take that smile away, there's a very intelligent person behind that. And I think now a more mature person as well, who understands exactly what he wants, exactly how to go and get it, which speaks to your previous point that, he had this plan in the back of his mind. So, yeah, I completely understand it. I don't think it takes away anything from Daniel's last 4 or 5 years. In fact, quite the reverse. I think it's a feather in his cap because he's been willing to roll the dice with his career. A Formula One driver has a limited shelf life, and Daniel spent 4 years of that out in the wide world finding himself. And I think he's finally found that and realised that Red Bull is home after all.
I think that's a really great point to emphasise because this is the question that's going to be asked not only in the next few months when he's returning to F1 with the very stated public aim of trying to get back to Red Bull racing, but if in fact he does get back to Red Bull racing, the fact it's where he started and he had the choice to stay and he chose to leave, and those years were only middlingly successful depending on the lens you want to look at them through. But there has been development in that time. I think his Renault years in particular were pretty good, particularly that second season, ironically enough, after he'd already decided to leave. There were some really great performances that year. I wish I'd gone and checked this, but finished surprisingly high in the Drivers' Championship in 2020 as well. I want to say top 5. Arguably one of the strongest performers that year. So there is still development since he left Red Bull.
Yep.
If he does in fact make it back there, it won't be the guy that decided to pull up stumps and, as you say, sort of gamble on his own career and his own potential and make some of his own decisions. So I think that's something worth keeping in mind over the next, 12 races exactly, and then whatever comes after that. I want to take a bit of a broader view now before we move on to some other things, of course. We talked a little bit about, in our Daniel Ricciardo podcast, if you want to call it that, the fact that he's jumping into the slowest car in Formula One at the moment, the AlphaTauri car. It's been pretty problematic for both drivers, for one in particular who's no longer racing, obviously, but also Yuki Tsunoda has not talked about it in glowing terms. They brought some upgrades in Silverstone, mixed reviews, it's fair to say. There are more coming in Hungary. Are they so far off the back that we're going to be talking about this as Daniel and Yuki sort of battling in the lower places and we're going to have to discern some results, do you think? Or is there hope that AlphaTauri can turn things around this year before they take that decision to become more integrated in Red Bull in the next few seasons?
It's a really fascinating sort of juncture that we stand at because the midfield in Formula One is so hyper competitive. I can't remember a Formula One midfield as combative as this one is. From second place down, it's almost anyone's game. We've seen 5 different teams occupy that slot. There's Alpine in Monaco, Aston Martin's been there, Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren was there. Williams has suggested that it can do there. Haas on a good day is up there as well. So it's not just a case of AlphaTauri sorting its own performances out. And that's not a car that's trivial by any stretch of the imagination. It is a handful and probably won't suit Daniel if I'm honest. but it's got to sort that out and hope that everyone else falters a little bit such that they can catch up. The one saving grace I think that we've seen, and this is something that we've spoken on previous episodes, is whenever you seem to bring an update, if it works, you tend to make a jump because there's so much low-hanging fruit. So if AlphaTauri can bring a couple of upgrades between now and the end of the season, then yeah, quite possibly they could steal a couple of points here and there. But that's all we're talking here. We're not talking podiums. We're not talking regular top 5 or 6 finishes. We're talking 9th or 10th in an unusual race. By and large, they're going to be racing with Alex Albon and Logan Sargent at the back. Probably Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen as well with the Haas, because they've gone nowhere as well. We're going to be reading between the lines, probably doing sector analysis to understand what Daniel's doing, what that car is doing as well, because it's not just, is Daniel good or bad? Is that car good or bad? So it's going to be a lot of head-to-head comparisons with Tsunoda. The old adage is the first person you've got to beat in Formula 1 is your teammate. So that's the first measure that we have to draw. And if you can't do that, then yeah, we don't even need to look at a second measure. But we're not going to be talking about points, I don't think, by any stretch. They might luck into 1 or 2 here and there. And Yuki Tsunoda has 2 points to this point in the championship. It's a pipe dream. I think that the game has moved on. It's far too competitive, and they haven't found anywhere near enough in the upgrades that they've bought. Let's not rule them out, but I'm pretty confident in saying that, yeah, we're going to be doing a lot of sector analysis, Michael.
I'm getting into the numbers, looking for where's that 10th and all that kind of thing. It will be interesting to see the team's progress. Like you say, it's so tight, but it does, there are teams that are effectively locking out the points paying places at the moment in Formula One. So it'll either take maybe a bit of rain or a particular outlying circuit. We don't have that many, although I do know Las Vegas can be very cold for a street track as well. So
and very fast, yeah.
Yes, and very fast. So you don't know. We'll wait and see, and there are upgrades to come. And just final one on this. We've talked a little bit about how this is also going to be an opportunity for Yuki Tsunoda to benchmark himself. In some ways, a little bit less on the line than Daniel, because I think there are more ways for him to win without outright winning. Being close to a competitive Ricciardo will still look good for him, considering he's been a bit of an unknown quantity, I guess, for the last 3 years, and obviously dispatching Nick de Vries only 10 Grand Prix. Very impressive, but not really enough time to know how good de Vries was either, so a double-edged sword, I suppose. But what I think is really interesting, Matt, is that for the last week, and we've done 2 podcasts now, we're talking a lot about Daniel. There's been a lot of talk about Daniel. People are excited to see him back. He's very popular. We know that, all that kind of stuff. There's the performance element that Tsunoda must be thinking about, but also the fact that he is now, not that he was ever necessarily like the de facto, lightning rod for AlphaTauri, but he's going to be very much in the shadow publicity and interest-wise in a team that has been his for 3 years. How do you think he's going to take that? Because that's something that is often a little bit more unpredictable in terms of driver reactions when they're very much shaded purely in the popularity sense, I suppose.
Yuki Tsunoda has been regarded as one of the best performers by his peers this season. So he's performing well on track. In terms of the media attention that he gets, outside of the Japanese media, he doesn't get a lot as it is anyway. So even though he's been leading that team and burying Nick de Vries all season, there haven't been a lot of trumpets being blown about Yuki Tsunoda, because ultimately he's finishing, 18th, 19th. He's down the back invariably because the car's just not good enough. That's not necessarily a reflection on him. That's the AlphaTauri is, it's a horse and cart. That's probably a little bit harsh, but it's just not there. I take that back. That's not fair on them. But it's a really hard measure. He's not going to get the accolades. All the attention will go to Daniel, as you say, because he's a race winner. He's a guy that, in the right circumstances a couple of years ago, was a fringe contender for a world championship. I don't think he's ever had that in his Formula One career. Previously, he was alongside Pierre Gasly, who, again, didn't really garner that attention until the very end, when there were suggestions that he was going to leave AlphaTauri and go to Alpine, which is exactly what happened. And that was sort of when Tsunoda really focused. So I wonder if there's a little bit of honey badger in Yuki Tsunoda as well, in that with all the attention going over there, that just solidifies himself in himself. He's a hard one to read, isn't he? Because he speaks English, but it's a comparatively broken English. It's difficult to get a big, expansive answer in terms of what's going on in his mind, because he just doesn't have the comprehension of the language in sufficient detail to give us that in depth. He's also probably not the personality either. He just wants to go out there and drive the car and then come back in and eat good food. He's massive on his food, is Yuki Tsunoda. So it's difficult to really get into his mindset. But from what I've seen from Pierre Gasly, this is a really long way of answering your question. I think he's going to be. He's going to get a shot in the arm from this. He's going to have something to prove. And as I say, when we saw him against Pierre Gasly in the latter stages of last year, that's when suddenly we were saying, could this guy lead AlphaTauri? Yeah, he probably could. I don't know about your interactions with Yuki, Michael, but that's certainly the impression I got, that he prefers to walk quietly and do his talking on the track. Certainly when it comes to that stuff, if you ask him about food, he'll talk for an hour.
Yeah, it's a good call. I think that there's I think there is by racing driver standards, relatively sensitive soul inside Yuki Tsunoda, and I think he actually benefits from not being too much in demand, I suppose. Sometimes I worry if he almost, his English is getting massively better compared to the first year. He's much more expressive, but almost if he was asked too much, he might say too much almost, or become too pensive about the way he's going about his business. I think actually acting in the shadows, as it is, next to Daniel Ricciardo, might help him. Unless some of that rubs off onto him and then a lot more people are talking to him, then maybe it's sort of perverse. But I think actually just getting his head down and doing the business has, over the last 2 years, proved hugely beneficial for him. Whether that was the move to Faenza and being sort of in a town he knows nothing about and where no one knows him, just getting down to it. Yep. I think there could actually be benefits for him in that sense. So I don't think there's any reason, if he's going to give Daniel a good run for his money, there's no reason to discount based on any conditions that will be possible. But we'll wait and see. That's the beauty of the 12 race challenge. I guess we've got the next two races will be interesting in themselves, but it'll be really after the break, I think, that we really start to get into the meat of this one. Let's change subject now a lot, but not too much. I mean, let's talk about Sergio Pérez. He is tangentially related to this, but I want to talk about him for his own right here, because he has been one of the stories of the season. Started off with his title challenge. There's no title challenge on. We've got that out of the way now, but he's been in this form spiral, really. We briefly thought he was breaking out of it in Austria. It wasn't to be, based on his results in Silverstone. I thought it was really interesting, Matt, that after the British Grand Prix, Christian Horner was obviously asked about it, and he said he will bounce back in Hungary. He will. It was definitive. He knew it was going to happen. Sergio Pérez never finished higher than fifth in Hungary. I mean, he's only had a car that's been well suited to this track for the last couple of years, I suppose. So midfield cars, you can't always say where they're going to perform. But I mean, is it a matter of will and must now, and the intention is going to be as important as the overall result if things don't go his way, or does he absolutely need to have a podium finish this weekend to sort of quiet it down some of these critics?
The language from Christian Horner has changed, hasn't it? Because it's gone from just needs to relax to no, he will perform better. That doesn't speak to me of encouragement or someone whose patience is yet to reach the end of its tether. That's someone that's now expecting an improved performance. You will do better. That's pretty indicative, isn't it? It's like being called into the boss's office and told, no, you will be here on time. It's not a request. It's a demand. And after 5 weekends where it's a single lap pace, that is where Sergio is struggling at the moment. He's struggling to deliver on a single lap in qualifying. His race pace has been good, but he's just been starting too far back. And when you start in the midfield, your race is compromised by the time you hit the pits for the first time, a third of the way through the race. The race is already half a lap up the road from you. You've got no chance of clawing that back. So he needs to improve his Saturdays. If he can improve the Saturdays, then even if he qualifies fourth, that's good enough, because the Red Bull will clear whatever second and third is, and you'll deliver Red Bull a 1-2. And ultimately, that's all they care about. They want the points. They want the bragging rights. They don't necessarily care how much in terms of how that's delivered to them. If you start seventh and you're an Alain Prost, you don't qualify brilliantly, but you work your way forwards through a race and deliver the result. That's what they need from their number 2 driver. Max Verstappen's going to go out and get a swag full of pole positions. Sergio just needs to be tying up the other end. He needs to be that night watchman almost at the non-strikers end, as Steve Waugh bashes out another ton. Showing my age there a little bit, aren't I? Who's the Australian cricket captain these days?
Come on.
Right there, right.
I'm sure Max would appreciate this analogy as well.
yeah. That's it. So, it's an interesting dynamic because the pressure has now got to be on Sergio, doesn't it? I mean, if not from Max, certainly from himself. You look over a little bit further down the pit lane, and there's the AlphaTauri garage and a big smile coming out of it. He's under pressure. If he doesn't deliver, it's not just a case of, well, it's all right, try again next week. Every weekend that he goes racing now, he has one less opportunity. So he has to take every one of them between now and the end of the season and basically show Christian Horner and Helmut Marko that, no, I'm your man. Give them no excuse to look at Daniel. Because the only reason they're looking at Daniel now is because he's giving him that opportunity. Ultimately, this comes down to Sergio not delivering. They've got a car that's capable of absolutely decimating the field, but only half the garage is doing that. So I echo Christian Horner's sentiments in that he will do better because he has to do better. It's that simple, really, isn't it?
And this is not a track for poor qualifying either. Overtaking is not always easy in Budapest at the Hungaroring. And just to amp up the challenge, I've checked the forecast. And at the moment, rain on Friday and Saturday, his least favourite conditions. So for qualifying in particular, I mean, practice is whatever. Maybe it gives him a chance to adjust, I suppose. So maybe he would prefer both days to be wet. But if it's raining in qualifying, that is problematic for him potentially. But it's all in his court. It isn't a high-speed circuit either, which does sort of play to his... or against his disadvantages, if you like. It seems to be when he's trying to mimic Max's ability to sort of balance the car at high speed that he struggles the most. So this might be a good circuit to reset on if he can get the conditions he likes and ahead of a higher speed track like Belgium in a couple of weeks from now, or next week rather. The battle for second is what's really interesting here. And this will be pitted against the contrast of Red Bull bringing its first, perhaps only major upgrade package this weekend. They don't have a lot of development time. They've been bringing a little bits and pieces as we've gone through, but they've talked about this as an update rather than just sort of tweaking as most teams do from race to race. The big focus is going to be on McLaren, though, whether or not that team can be second again. Both Lando Norris and Andrea Stella sort of talked down that chance, considering this is a dramatically different circuit to the last two. But they have said they are expecting more performance, particularly in terms of race pace from this latest package. Both drivers will have it. What do you think the chances are here? Because while, slow corners were their weakest in Silverstone, they weren't that bad, and they were pretty comfortably second quickest. Is it that far-fetched to think that they could at least be thereabouts this weekend?
The McLaren pace at the British Grand Prix was all through sort of Maggots, Beckett's, and Stowe. It was all that final part of the lap, not the twisty new section, the infield. New section is, 10 years old now? But it's the McLaren is weak at low speed. It has been all season. Whatever updates I've got, it's not going to be a light switch moment for them. It's not going to be a case of suddenly they're going to turn on more performance. It's not that simple in Formula One. If it was that simple, we'd see the order changing every other week. So Hungary is going to be a struggle. Now, if it's wet, then maybe McLaren will look a little bit better than in reality they are, because we know, again, that car likes cooler conditions. It's very good at turning its tyres on. But then, at least prior to Austria, it would burn them up quite quickly. So when they say the upgrades are about race pace, it's about improving the thermal degradation of the tyres. That's effectively what they're working to cure, opening up that operating window. That's what gives you race pace. That's what's hindered them thus far, because they've had to either slow down or have no grip. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Before Silverstone, I'd have suggested that McLaren is going to be a way out of the points. Some way, 12th, 13th, 14th. They'll be battling with probably the Williams and the AlphaTauris, would have been my guess. After Austria and Silverstone, maybe 9th and 10th. I don't think we're going to be looking at second and third. There's other as we say second and third, having just spoken about Sergio Pérez. So let's go third and fourth. Let's be generous because he will improve. We'll have,
he will
yes,
improve.
that's it. Yeah, absolutely. We've got Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin. Aston Martin were usually pretty good at lower speed stuff as well. You think back to Monaco, so I'd expect a stronger showing from them. So you add that competition in there, and suddenly this again speaks to the incredible battle in the F1 midfield where you don't have to be far off the pace. 0.5% off the pace is huge around a lap time where the midfield's separated by 3 or 4 tenths. So I don't expect to be writing McLaren surprises, McLaren on the front row. I don't think those headlines are going to be coming out of this weekend. What we're going to be saying is that McLaren solidifies updates or improved pace with points finish. That's, I think, the storyline that we're going to get out of the Hungarian Grand Prix. And then I think it'll revert to more Silverstone spec when we get to Spa a week later.
Yeah, but you never can expect writing surprise in a headline. It's the beauty of the surprise, right? So that's not so bad. I mean, you look at it's true. It's rare you get fundamental changes in the way a car works in a season. But we have seen in McLaren's case, the upgrade was enormous, made some big difference. Aston Martin in one season's made a pretty big difference. It's not out of the realms of possibility the car can be better than we expect. But I think you're right. I'm not expecting them to be the top of the midfield, if not least because Aston Martin, as you say, does normally perform well at these tracks, and they're sort of due a good result. I feel like that there's going to be one building this weekend, so we will wait and see how that pans out. That's this weekend's Hungarian Grand Prix. Before we wrap this one up, I want to go back. We said we'd talk about this at the end of last week's podcast. It's news in the last couple of weeks. We've got the 2024 calendar release, not even halfway through 2023, and we already know what we're going to be doing next year. Things really have changed in Formula One in the last couple of years, haven't we? Remarkable.
Yeah. Normally
it is
September.
a record.
Yeah,
it's incredible, isn't it? It's a record-breaking long calendar, 24 races. We were meant to have 24 this year, to be fair. Hasn't happened. There have been various times over the last couple of years records have been broken, but this will be the most if we get through the full allocation of them. So I guess a little asterisk there, but the intention seems to be that we will probably get there. I think it's really interesting, Matt, every time we have broken a record in the last 5 years in particular, when we've ramped up the number of races, team principals have been asked, and you think this is a bit hard, particularly given the incidence of triple headers as we have now, and they always say, well, this is the limit. 22 is the limit. Well, 23 is the limit. Well, 24 I think is the limit. Is 24 the limit, or do you think we will open the door to more in the next couple of years, noting particularly that the Concord Agreement is up for renewal, potentially earlier before its expiry in 2025?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think 25 races is the number in the Concord Agreement. So they've got one up their sleeve, hypothetically, if they wanted it. And we know that there are a lot of markets that are interested in having Formula One, but 24 races, I guess we can speak to it from our experience in the media. There's not many journalists that go to every event anymore. Now, once upon a time when there were 10, 12, 14, 16 races, a lot of journalists will go to every race, but with 24 races, the time away from home is extraordinary because you leave on a Wednesday, particularly if you're European-based, you leave on a Wednesday, you're there across the weekend, so Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, some might go back Sunday night, others go back Monday, you go home, and then you're back at the airport on Wednesday for a double header or a triple header. And those triple headers, I did Imola, Monaco, Spain. Obviously, Imola didn't happen, but I still did all the travel and everything else for it. You come home and you are absolutely wrecked. And that was after one. If there's multiples of those in a season, and then you have a week off, and then you're in a double header, which that's the case at the end of the year, I think, isn't it, with the Americas and then on to Abu Dhabi. That's brutal. And it's not... The drivers are in a very privileged position where they get the best flights and private charters and all those sorts of things. They're not the people that you're worried about. It's the burnout in the rank and file. And you need only look at the burnout rate in NASCAR, which has 32 race weekends. I think 36 events, but 32 actual competitive championship races over the course of a season. The burnout rate over there is extreme. And they're doing it domestically. We're doing not 32 competitive race events, but it's still 24 and I think 39 weeks, I think I counted the other day. That's a massive schedule. There's not many nights spent at home in your own bed. So for people that are perhaps married with kids, that's almost unsustainable. It's almost compelling teams to go after younger single staff members because they're the only people who are going to be attracted to certainly the travel aspect of it, because it's not, you're not staying in 5-star hotels. They're long days, even with the curfew and things now, they're still long days. Working in the factory is going to be a little bit easier, obviously, because it's effectively an office job. But 24 races in, I think it was 21 countries, because we do go to a couple of countries a few times, the Americas and Italy, the Americas, the United States specifically. That's a massive ask. You're going to get burnout. Teams are going to have to start rotating through their staff. Some teams already do that. Some teams travel with physios and doctors purely for their team members. So there's all those sorts of things that you need to consider. It's not just a case of satisfying the viewing public. It's keeping a healthy workforce, an enthused workforce, an engaged workforce, and then all the suppliers behind that, because a lot of these components are off the shelf, so to speak. So there's a whole industry that supports Formula One behind it that is going to be under similar amounts of pressure. I think it's not going to be a problem now, but in 2 or 3 years' time, when we're struggling to retain some of the fundamental staff, maybe at that point it needs to be looked at. I understand why Liberty Media is doing this, because its income is derived through 3 main pillars. One is hosting fees. The more races you have, the more money you earn, obviously. The other is television rights. And then there's a third pillar, which is basically trackside advertising, corporate hospitality, Formula 2, Formula 3, those sorts of things. So obviously, increase races, increase revenue, increase trackside signage, increase corporate hospitality spend. So you can ratchet up your income by adding races. But there's a downside. I think the sport's lucky that we've got Stefano Domenicali at the helm. He's come from Ferrari. He understands how these teams operate and their needs. But he's also empowered and entrusted to make Liberty Media money. So it's interesting. He's not going to be working in the team's best interests. If they're aligned with the Liberties, then so be it. That's great. That's fantastic. That's a bonus. But his job is to make money for Liberty Media, not necessarily keep the teams happy.
It's really interesting, isn't it? The staff retention one is interesting. And it's something that, there's always a little bit of a conflict, isn't there? A lot of fans want more races, and I think that's good. More content is great, and Formula One racing when it's at its best. And, the last time maybe was, we got a lot of good racing last year, and 2021 certainly. You could certainly imagine, some people probably couldn't imagine that season going for longer, but the tightness of that battle meant you probably could have watched that all year.
Mercedes was pretty keen on going a little bit longer.
Yeah, maybe a bit shorter for some people, I guess, 1 or 2 laps. And then this year, though, there tends to be a little bit of a drop-off when championships are sewn up and there's not a lot to fight for in the last, let's say, quarter of a third of a season. So more races is always interesting in that perspective. Of course, the idea is for racing to be closer under these regulations, so that kind of, in a sense, solves itself. But the regulation of staff one is a very interesting one, particularly considering, and this is probably a topic for another day, but there's such a battle now under the cost cap for particular members of staff. Now, a lot of those are factory-based staff. We're talking about chief technical officers, aerodynamicists, that kind of thing. But some of them are race-to-race kind of guys, people who have to travel to races because they need to be really closely connected with the car or with the driver. Ensuring that they're able to be present and preventing them from rotating around too much, obviously, because too much rotation means a lot of these guys end up on gardening leave for long periods of time, when you actually mean that they're completely expelled from the system fundamentally for a year or two, which is its own interesting dimension. I think it's just an additional element to the multiple races, the expansion of the calendar, that will have a really interesting side effect, like you say, in the next couple of years. And then, if we do get to 25 or higher, I don't think we're likely to, but it is there and it is possible. And the teams all have a habit of agreeing when they are told they will make a little bit of extra money. It will be a really interesting extra element. But that is thoroughly next year's problem. This year, there are only 12 races.
I will also qualify this in that I spoke with Stefano Domenicali over the Australian Grand Prix weekend and put exactly this point to him. It's like, well, expanding the calendar is great. I can understand why you're doing it. But what about staff retention? What about the ability of teams to attract the brightest and the best, because historically that's what Formula One has done. And it's like, no one's forcing him to work in Formula One. You work here because you've got a passion for it and you love it. If you don't have that passion, if you're not prepared to put the time and effort in, go and work in aerospace or another industry. And I guess he walks the walk as well. He's a father. He's got a family himself. So he's not asking them to do anything he doesn't do. But it's a very different approach from Stefano Domenicali to what we just spoke about.
Yes, it's true. He does do, he is at every race. He emphasised that a lot. Does fly in a different end of the aeroplane, but I mean, we probably could have expected that anyway. It's just sort of the way it is. Probably largely discussion for future seasons, I suppose. We'll analyse this over the course of future years. But for now, that's all the time we have on Pit Talk for this week in preview of the Hungarian Grand Prix. We'll be back next week to wrap up Daniel Ricciardo's first race back in the cockpit after fully 10 races out, and all the other goings-on from Budapest. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube. Just search for Fox Sports Australia Pit Talk. You can also read coverage of this weekend's Grand Prix at foxsports.com.au and, of course, at Speed Cafe as well. From Matt Cock, my name is Michael Laminato. We'll catch you next week.